The ocean groaned as it slapped against the black volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. A cruel wind swept low across the jagged coastline, carrying sand, salt, and something else. The scent of ash. From above, the island seemed small, almost insignificant. 8 square miles of hardened earth in the vast blue throat of the Pacific. But down on the ground, beneath the sand and stone, something ancient stirred. Something defiant. Something waiting. It was February 1945, and the war in the Pacific had become a grinding storm. The United States, armed with its unstoppable industrial machine, had crossed thousands of miles of ocean in a campaign of island-hopping fury. The names were already becoming legend: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. But Iwo Jima was different, not just because it sat halfway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo, but because it had become a fortress, a tomb, a final vow of resistance. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi knew this, knew he could not win. But he did not plan to lose easily. Instead of building his defenses at the beaches like so many before him, he turned the very belly of the island into a labyrinth. Under his command, Japanese engineers carved a 13-mile tunnel network into the rock. Bunkers, artillery chambers, sniper nests, supply vaults. These were not caves by chance. They were war machines built of earth and silence, invisible, waiting. Kuribayashi forbade the banzai charges that had become synonymous with Japanese defense. There would be no screaming rush into machine guns this time. Instead, his men would vanish beneath the soil and bleed the Americans slowly, with method and malice. They would live underground, fight underground, die underground. They were told to kill 10 Americans before falling. Many would come close. Above ground, the American invasion force was unaware of what lay beneath. Marines studied aerial maps. Navy commanders prepped for bombardment. The mood was confident, arrogant even. After all, hadn't Saipan fallen in weeks? Didn't their bombers own the sky? Wasn't Iwo Jima small? They bombed it for 70 days straight, the longest sustained naval bombardment of the Pacific War. Over 5,000 tons of shells rained down. The earth heaved and cracked, smoke swallowing the ridges and sands. It was thought that nothing could survive such destruction. But the Japanese weren't on the surface. They were inside the mountain. When the Marines landed on February 19th, the beaches were quiet. Too quiet. The black sand was soft and volcanic, making it hard to run. Landing craft opened like steel jaws, releasing wave after wave of young men in olive drab. Some laughed nervously, some muttered prayers, some clutched letters from home. For a few minutes, it looked like the beachhead would be taken without a fight. Then, without warning, the island screamed. From nowhere, machine gun fire erupted from hidden pillboxes. Mortar shells rained down from invisible ridges. Japanese artillery, hidden in rotating, reinforced bunkers, opened up with deadly precision. Within moments, the beach became a slaughterhouse. The Marines, pinned and confused, dug into the sand. But the sand offered no cover, only more targets. The illusion of an easy landing shattered as men fell in droves, their bodies torn apart before they ever saw the enemy. The truth was dawning. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, not in the trees, not in trenches, but in the bones of the island itself. Every ridge hid a trap. Every cave hid a weapon. Some soldiers said it felt like the island was alive, like it was hunting them. Mount Suribachi loomed at the southern tip, casting a long shadow across the beach. From its heights, Japanese spotters relayed positions to gunners buried deep in the rock. The Americans would later raise a flag there in a moment of iconic triumph. But in these early days, The mountain was death itself. What made Iwo Jima so hellish wasn't just the combat. It was the invisibility of it. Japanese snipers fired through holes the size of coins. They vanished into tunnels before return fire could reach them. Entire squads disappeared chasing ghosts into caves. Men were dragged into the darkness and never seen again. The Marines weren't just fighting men. They were fighting architecture, doctrine, and a death cult of national pride. And as the days passed, the bodies piled up, not in hundreds, in thousands. General Kuribayashi, somewhere deep beneath the surface, monitored it all. His strategy wasn't built on hope, it was built on time. Time to inflict wounds so deep the Americans would hesitate before invading the Japanese homeland. Time to make them question the cost of continuing the war. Time to show that even defeat could be made sacred. But the Americans had something else. Relentless logistics. For every Japanese bullet, they brought 10 shells. For every hidden cave, they devised a counter. And when bullets and grenades weren't enough, they began to look to something else, something elemental. The Americans began to whisper about flamethrowers. Tanks that spewed napalm, men who carried fire on their backs like demons from some mechanical underworld. But that would come later. For now, they were still trapped in a war of inches, bleeding for every foot of black sand and jagged stone. Every night, the island shook. Every day, the smoke returned. No one could sleep. The screams never stopped. What Iwo Jima revealed, more than anything, was the impossibility of surrender when pride buries itself underground. It wasn't just about tactics or terrain. It was about philosophy. The Japanese believed their deaths could still serve the empire. The Americans believed their survival was owed to one another. Two civilizations collided in silence and smoke, beneath a red sky and an unforgiving sun. The island would not fall. It would be excavated, burned, and bled out. And even then, it would never truly surrender. It began with a smell. A sour, metallic sting in the back of the throat. Not the familiar tang of cordite or the earthy rot of blood-soaked sand, but something heavier, something thicker, like burning oil and scorched meat, clinging to the lungs like tar. The men didn't speak of it at first. Some couldn't. Their voices had turned hoarse from smoke and dust. But soon enough, the whispers circled through the ranks. The Marines had brought fire. It was the engineers who first carried the burden. Those young men trained not in rifles, but in tanks and chemicals, demolition charges and blowtorches. They were the ones tasked with solving the problem that bullets and bravery couldn't fix. The tunnels were too deep, the enemy too hidden. They needed something more primal, more final. The solution came strapped to a man's back. The M2 flamethrower, officially designated as a portable flame weapon, was anything but elegant. 2 cylinders filled with a thick gasoline and napalm mixture, connected to a compression tank and a handheld wand. Pull the trigger, and a tongue of flame roared forward, a stream of living fire reaching up to 40 meters, igniting everything in its path. In theory, it was a tool of war. In practice, it was something else entirely. The first time it was used in the caves of Iwo Jima, the effect was immediate. A squad had found a Japanese bunker carved into the ridge, a machine gun nest that had already cut down 2 waves of infantry. The opening was small, shielded by rock and reinforced by steel. Grenades bounced off harmlessly. Rifles were useless. Then Corporal Jensen stepped forward. He was only 21, carried 60 pounds of steel and fuel on his back. His face was already streaked with ash. No one spoke as he approached. Just the hiss of the wand's igniter and the deep, gurgling churn of the tanks. He squeezed the trigger. What came out wasn't just fire. It was a torrent, a pillar of blazing gel that poured into the mouth of the bunker like molten punishment. The cave didn't explode. It howled. Inside, everything was fire. Walls, uniforms, flesh. The screams began in an instant and ended just as quickly, smothered beneath a roar of combustion and collapsing stone. When the squad moved forward, the bunker was quiet. There were no survivors. After that, the M2 became more than a weapon. It became a solution. Across the island, where the terrain was too jagged and the enemy too buried, flamethrowers led the way. They were mounted on tanks, integrated into platoons, handed to trembling hands of young Marines who had never imagined they'd carry such a burden. The jungle didn't just smell of rot anymore. It reeked of napalm, scorched fur, charred bone. But with every cave cleared, a toll was taken, not just on the enemy, but on the ones wielding the fire. Private Martin wrote in his field journal, "They gave me the dragon's breath today. Said it would save lives." I don't know. The cave was full of screams, and then it was just crackling. Nothing left to shoot at. Nothing left. The flamethrower was efficient. It turned psychological warfare into physical reality. Inside those caves, Japanese soldiers weren't just hiding. They were choking. The fire sucked the oxygen from the chamber, turning air to poison. If the flames didn't reach them, the heat did. If the heat didn't kill them, the collapse of the tunnel walls would. The Japanese feared it more than any other weapon. To them, death in battle was sacred. But to die burning, blinded, gasping in darkness, it was unclean, undignified, even unforgivable. American commanders knew this. The goal was not just to clear ground, it was to break morale, if there was any left to break. The tactical strategy evolved rapidly. By the second week, cave-clearing units were equipped with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and rifle support. They operated in coordinated sweeps. Find an opening, flush it with fire, seal it with explosives, then move on to the next. Some caves were reused by Japanese soldiers after the Americans passed. Others were booby-trapped with grenades tied to tripwires or corpses. One Marine stepped into a cave to check for movement. He found only silence. Then the walls collapsed, triggered by a hidden fuse. He was never found. There was no front line on Iwo Jima. Only shadows, holes, and the smell of smoke. The flame troopers became both feared and isolated. Among their own, they were sometimes avoided, not out of contempt, but out of discomfort. The men who carried fire seemed older, even if they weren't. Their eyes held something the others hadn't seen, or didn't want to. One sergeant said, "We used to talk about going home, about baseball, or girls, or cars. The flame boys didn't. They just cleaned their gear and waited." Because they knew, if they fell, they wouldn't just die. They'd burn. The fuel tanks on their backs turned them into walking targets. A single bullet could turn them into a torch. And the Japanese knew it too. Snipers aimed for the tanks first. Ambushes prioritized the flame troopers. They were seen as devils, men without mercy. The Japanese called them ghosts with fire for blood. Some of them began to believe it. But the reality was simpler. It wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. Every foot of ground gained on Iwo Jima cost lives. The Marines were running out of time, running out of patience, running out of men. The tunnels had to be cleared, and if it meant using fire, they would use it. They didn't celebrate the kills. They didn't pose for photographs. Most didn't even talk about it. They just moved forward. The caves, once bastions of defiance, became ovens. Places where memory and flame blurred, where screams echoed for seconds and silence lingered for hours. A war waged in darkness had met its answer in light, searing, ruthless, total. There were moments when the fire backfired. One cave belched smoke and then erupted violently, sending napalm-coated rocks raining down on American troops. One Marine lost his leg to a stone that had been soaked in flame. Another choked to death on the chemical smoke that drifted back out of a sealed chamber. War doesn't care who it kills, fire least of all. But still they carried it, into the next cave, the next bunker, the next night of heat and ash and silence. By the third week, the island had changed. Not just physically, though the once green slopes were now a patchwork of soot and ruin, but spiritually. Iwo Jima was no longer a battlefield. It was something more biblical, a place where men had learned what it meant to burn for survival. The M2 Flamethrower didn't win the war. It didn't even win the island. But it cracked the shell. It forced the enemy to feel vulnerable in their deepest sanctuaries. It stripped away the illusion of safety beneath the stone. It turned courage into vapor and certainty into smoke. And for the men who carried the flame, it left something inside them that never cooled. Beneath the sulfuric sky of Iwo Jima, where the black volcanic ash never settled and the wind carried embers like whispers of the dead, the battle narrowed to names carved into horror. Mount Suribachi, Hill 382, the amphitheater, the meat grinder. These weren't just coordinates. They were crucibles, where flesh, metal, and morality were ground together into something unrecognizable. Each name became a chapter in a story no man wanted to tell, a wound in the earth that refused to close. Mount Suribachi was the first. Rising 554 feet from the island's southern tip, it stood like a watching god, its slopes silent, its veins brimming with bunkers. For days, American Marines had pounded the mountain with artillery and naval gunfire. It seemed impossible that anything inside had survived. But when infantry crept toward its base, the mountain opened fire. Machine guns appeared from rocks that had no seams. Mortars launched from holes the size of baseballs. It wasn't a mountain, it was a hive, alive, watching. And at the base of it, the flamethrowers began their work. Assault squads moved in threes, one carrying the M2, another with a satchel charge, the third on rifle watch. They worked in rhythm, like demolition artists in hell. The flame would flush the cave, licking through corridors. Then came the charge, hurled into the glowing void. A breath, then collapse. It wasn't just enemy soldiers who were buried. It was their silence, their heat, their last breath. One Marine wrote home, "I saw a man catch fire. Not from us, from them. They had fuel caches inside, and when we hit it, it was like the earth screamed. For a moment, I didn't know who was burning. Then I smelled it. You never forget that smell. When Mount Suribachi fell, it did not fall with honor or surrender. It was pulled down, brick by brick, bunker by bunker, until only smoke and stone remained. The iconic flag went up on the summit on February 23rd, a symbol of triumph. But for those who fought below, there was no celebration, only numbness. Further north lay Hill 382, and with it came a deeper descent into madness. Here, in what came to be known as the meat grinder, the land was stitched with interlocking defenses. Pillboxes covered by snipers, machine gun nests protected by mortar triangulation, and underground hospitals doubling as ambush chambers. Every position had multiple exits. Kill one soldier, and another would crawl through a side shaft minutes later. Flame a tunnel, and you'd hear movement again before the soot cooled. So the Americans adapted. They brought in M4 Sherman tanks, retrofitted with POA CWS H5 flamethrower units. Steel dragons that belched fire in rolling walls, saturating positions that infantry couldn't reach. These weren't precise weapons. They were messages. The tanks rumbled forward, their tracks grinding across lava rock, hoses snaking like vipers from the turret. They would pause, hiss, and then a torrent of flame, loud enough to drown out prayer. The napalm stuck to everything. It crawled, it pooled in corners, it turned uniforms into traps. Even the stone began to crack under the heat, rebar inside bunkers curled like ribbon. Cave water began to boil. Men drowned, not in blood, but in steam. And yet, even here, even in the furnace, the Japanese fought on. In one instance, a flamethrower tank rolled over a tunnel exit and began flooding it with fire. Moments later, a Japanese soldier emerged from a side shaft with a satchel charge, crawling through flame-blackened brush. He reached the tank. The explosion tore its underbelly out. All 5 crewmen died. Survivors later found their remains fused to the tank's interior. The steel had melted around their bones. This was not war. It was alchemy, where heat, pressure, and time distorted everything once human. And those who carried the flame knew it. Flame troopers, already marked for death by snipers, bore the weight of moral isolation. Some began to question their purpose. Others questioned their soul. A corporal named Ryan wrote, "The others kill fast, I kill slow. I hear them. They don't scream long. But they scream. I tell myself it's better than losing another 10 men to clear a cave. But sometimes I wonder what my mother would say if she saw me light another man on fire." There were moments of intimacy amidst the destruction, not with the enemy, but with the earth itself. The volcanic soil turned to glass under sustained flame. Marines walked on razor edges of obsidian. Some swore they saw reflections, not of themselves, but of the faces they had just erased. The fire didn't just kill. It preserved, in grotesque tableau, charred hands frozen in prayer, melted rifles embedded in stone, teeth gleaming white in sockets of blackened skulls. And still, the orders came. Clear the next hill, flush the next cave, seal the next mouth of the island. Each assault was measured in feet, in gallons. The average M2 operator carried 7 gallons of fuel, enough for 2 or 3 bursts. Sometimes that was all the difference between victory and being buried under collapsing rock. There was a strategy to it, yes, a cold calculus. General Schmidt, commanding the Marines, noted in his diary, "We cannot afford to lose men to ghosts. The enemy has weaponized the terrain. Fire is our equalizer. Let the caves become ovens." But beneath the tactics lay something more human, a gnawing contradiction. The same hands that offered rations to wounded civilians on Saipan now ignited compounds that turned men into ash. The same soldiers who cried over letters from home now wiped soot from their eyes as they watched cave mouths roar and then fall silent. Victory was coming. The island was shrinking. But the cost was growing. By early March, over 20,000 Japanese defenders had fought nearly to the last man. The Americans had lost 7,000 dead and 20,000 wounded. The flame had done its job. The caves were emptying. The mountain was quiet. But in the silence came reckoning. Post-war interviews with veterans often avoided one subject, the flamethrower. Not because it was secret, but because it was sacred in its horror. Too powerful, too intimate. As one Marine chaplain wrote, "A bullet is clean, it enters and it leaves. But fire stays. It lingers in the eyes, in the lungs, in the soul." On Iwo Jima, the enemy did not surrender. They dissolved. And the men who made that happen who melted steel and bone. We're left to carry that truth back home, where no one truly understood what it meant to burn a man alive and call it necessary. Inside the caves, the air was different. It carried no salt from the sea, no hint of life, only dampness, smoke, and the slow rot of exhaustion. The tunnels pulsed with muffled echoes, the drip of condensed water from the stone ceiling, the clatter of empty cartridges kicked aside, the distant groan of the earth as American shells struck above. In that darkness, men sat in silence, some praying, some sharpening bayonets they would never use again. They had stopped counting days. Time had lost meaning. The only light came from candles made of melted wax and rations fat, flickering against walls lined with soot and carved slogans of the emperor's name. They knew the fire was coming. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a sound, a hiss, a roar that built like a beast inhaling. And then, all at once, the tunnel would light up like the sun had been forced underground. To the men trapped within, the flamethrower wasn't a weapon. It was the end of the world. The Japanese diaries found after the battle tell stories that Americans rarely read aloud. Private Matsuda wrote, "They have a weapon that eats air. It comes like liquid light." The men ahead of me did not scream. They melted. Another note, written in the dirt with a charred stick, read simply, "To burn is to vanish without honor." For these soldiers, death was supposed to be clean, a bayonet to the chest, a final charge into gunfire, a name shouted to the heavens before silence. That was death with purpose, death that could be witnessed. But to die in a cave, unseen and unmarked, your body reduced to ash and vapor, that was to be erased. It was not death. It was obliteration. And in the code of Bushido, it carried a shame far deeper than surrender. In the hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese mindset, surrender itself was the greatest dishonor imaginable. A soldier captured alive was thought to poison his family's name. Mothers were taught that the highest virtue was to outlive their sons, but only to bow to their sacrifice, not to their shame. On Iwo Jima, there were no plans for retreat. General Kuribayashi's final order had been absolute. Each man will kill 10 of the enemy before dying. There will be no survivors. So when the flamethrowers came, many Japanese soldiers didn't wait. They pulled grenades close to their chests. They drank from canteens laced with cyanide. Some clasped photographs of loved ones before pulling the pin. And in that moment, that instant between obedience and oblivion, they made their final stand against dishonor, not against the enemy. A surviving officer later wrote, "We did not fear death. We feared being found alive." There were moments when American soldiers, stepping into freshly cleared tunnels, found bodies still smoking, grenades clutched in skeletal hands. Others found small bundles, a diary, a photo, a lock of hair sealed in a paper envelope, remnants of men who had chosen to vanish rather than burn. Yet, even in death, the Japanese found ways to defy the flames. Some returned to the same caves the Americans thought they had cleared. They redug passages, rebuilt barricades, waited in silence for the next assault. There were reports of the same cave being burned 5 times. Each time it was declared safe, each time it came back to life, another volley, another ambush, another scream from the shadows. To the Marines, it was madness. To the defenders, it was ritual. By the 3rd week, even the flamethrower operators, men hardened by necessity, began to see the futility. The caves weren't just shelters. They were shrines. Every time fire entered, it turned not only soldiers to ash, but ideology to smoke. And yet, There was no victory in it, only attrition. American combat engineers described entering tunnels where the walls glowed from residual heat. Rifles melted into the rock, and the air shimmered with vaporized moisture. Inside, they sometimes found whole families, the wives and children of officers who had refused evacuation. They had been given pistols, instructed in how to die. No one had prepared them for fire. In the decades after the war, a few survivors broke their silence. Their testimonies were brief, halting, often punctuated by long pauses, the kind of pauses that come from reliving what should never be remembered. Lieutenant Takahashi, interviewed in 1968, said, "We lived like ghosts. The tunnels were our graves before the fire ever came. I heard my friend's voice calling out after the first burst, not screaming, just calling. Then there was no sound, only the hiss of something alive that did not stop until it reached me." He survived by crawling through a ventilation shaft filled with ash. When he emerged, the sky was red, the island shaking beneath constant bombardment. He said he never forgot the sight of the horizon that day. Not because it was beautiful, but because it looked like the inside of the caves, burning, endless, alive. What made Iwo Jima different from all that came before was not the number of deaths, though there were tens of thousands, but the manner of them. The flamethrower didn't kill at a distance. It killed in intimacy. It burned the faces of men close enough to see each other's eyes. And that proximity did something irreversible, not only to the body, but to the soul. For the Japanese soldier, it stripped away even the possibility of redemption. For the American Marine, it stripped away the illusion of righteousness. They faced each other across inches of flame, and for a moment, they were equals, both trapped in a kind of hell neither side had words for. The difference was that one side had chosen death, and the other had been ordered to deliver it. By the time Iwo Jima fell, fewer than 300 Japanese soldiers were taken alive, out of a force of more than 21,000. The rest had vanished into fire, stone, or silence. The caves that once echoed with oaths of loyalty became tombs. The air that once carried commands and prayers now carried only smoke. And somewhere, deep beneath the scorched mountain, the ghosts of those who refused to surrender still seemed to whisper, "Better to burn than to bow." When the Marines finally left, the caves remained, sealed, empty, sacred. The Americans never understood why so few surrendered, and the Japanese, even years later, never understood how anyone could wield that kind of fire and still sleep at night. In war, victory is measured in numbers. But on Iwo Jima, the math never added up. How do you measure courage when it ends in ash? How do you count lives when one side refuses to live? Fire won the battle. But in the silence that followed, no one could say who had truly survived. By the time the guns fell silent, Iwo Jima no longer resembled an island. It resembled a wound. The black sands had turned to ash-laced dust, fine, enough to cling to every boot and face. The ridges were craters. The caves, once defiant, were either buried or burned out, choked with soot and silence. The American flag flew high over Mount Suribachi, yes. But for the men who fought beneath that mountain, the sight brought no triumph. Only a deep, aching fatigue that sleep couldn't cure. The island was secured, they said. But what did that mean? That there were no more screams in the dark? No more booby-trapped tunnels? No more enemies willing to die just to take one more Marine with them? The ground was still hot in places. Bodies still smoldered. In some sealed caves, the fire still consumed whatever oxygen remained. And among the living, something else had started to burn. The flamethrower operators were among the first to go quiet. They had been hailed during the campaign as heroes, the fire-bringers, the bunker crushers, the reason the island could be taken at all. And yet, when they boarded the ships home, many of them spoke less than the wounded. They sat alone, ate alone, slept, when they could, alone. Their silence wasn't pride. It was weight. One Marine, decades later, said it plainly. I never talked about it because there was nothing to be proud of. I did what I had to. But I can still see the inside of those caves, still hear what came out of them. They didn't suffer wounds that could be stitched. Their scars weren't visible unless you looked into their eyes during a thunderstorm or a barbecue, or when a child asked what they did in the war. They would often pause, then change the subject. Post-traumatic stress, as it would come to be known, was not understood in 1945. Men were expected to carry on, to return to factories, families, and quiet lives. But many couldn't forget the heat, the smell, the moment when their hands pulled a trigger that turned a tunnel into a tomb. Nightmares came often. Some men awoke choking, convinced they were still in the caves. Others found themselves gripping the sheets like they were holding the wand of an M2 flamethrower. More than a few drank themselves into oblivion. Others simply withdrew, not out of shame, but out of the terrifying knowledge that to survive Iwo Jima, they had become someone else. And that man had no place in peace. Back on the mainland, America celebrated. Medals were pinned. Propaganda reels played footage of brave Marines raising the flag. The war in Europe was winding down. Victory felt near. But for those who knew what it took to take a patch of rock in the Pacific, those who saw what fire does to stone and to men, victory came laced with bitterness. Because they hadn't just killed soldiers. They had burned them alive. And even if it was necessary, even if it saved thousands of other lives, the memory never stopped glowing. After the war, the world began to rethink what it meant to wage total war. The Geneva Conventions were revised, new treaties were proposed, and among the weapons listed under growing scrutiny was the flamethrower. By 1978, the United States formally retired flamethrowers from active service. Not because they were ineffective, they weren't, but because of what they symbolized. A weapon designed not to wound or warn, but to annihilate. A weapon that didn't leave corpses, but shadows on walls. The world had seen enough of that. And yet, in military academies around the globe, the island of Iwo Jima is still studied. Not just for tactics, though there are lessons there in terrain warfare, engineering, and naval infantry coordination, but for its philosophy. Because Iwo Jima was more than a fight for land. It was a fight against the idea that some men would rather vanish into the earth than surrender. A fight against an enemy who believed death was cleaner than defeat. And the only way to break them was to become something darker. That truth makes it into fewer textbooks. Today, the beaches of Iwo Jima are quiet. The caves, sealed or collapsed, now serve as memorials. Tourists walk the sand with camera phones, unaware of the firestorms that once tore through the island. Veterans sometimes return, years later with family, to touch the stone, to find closure, to speak softly to ghosts. One such man, an old flamethrower operator, stood at the mouth of a bunker he once cleared. He knelt, said nothing for a long time. When asked what he felt, he said, "The fire went out a long time ago, but some part of me never left this place. I lit something here that still burns." That is the price of breaking stone. The enemy may fall, the stronghold may collapse, the land may change. But the men who carried the flame carry something else with them. Not shame, not glory. Something in between. Something no one else will ever fully understand.